Today we're continuing our series on civil discourse that we started last fall. And well, first I want to welcome our speaker, Linor Stein from Israel. She's here on a Jewish Agency Fellowship. And Reverend Rabbi Greg Harris from Temple Bethel, and Linor's friend, Shira. Now, so we're engaged in a civil discourse series that we started last fall with a structured program aiming at developing principles for tackling some tough issues, and that's what we're doing as we go forward into this Holy Land focused part of our series now for the entire month of March, where we're looking at Israel-Palestine issues. As many of you know, last Sunday we had Ambassador Philip Wilcox here. He gave us kind of an overview of the conflict, the history, the trajectory of the Israel-Palestine issue. Today Linor is going to speak. Next week we have a Palestinian speaker, Ala Hamouda, who some of you may have met from Gaza. And then our fourth Sunday will be an interfaith dialogue featuring our rector, Sarah Atik, and Rabbi Harris. And then our last session will be a discernment session moderated by former senior vestryman John Ross, who many of you, I'm sure, know. So just turning to introduce Linor before we go up on stage and begin. Linor is here, as I said, on a Jewish Agency for Israel Fellowship. It's part of what I understand is called Shlichut journey. It's kind of like a, if I can say, emissary from Israel working with local Jewish community to act as kind of an intermediary for ideas and education. Linor is in her third year of this Shlichut program. She worked at Boston University for 2 years, and now she's at Georgetown University. Linor was born in Ramat Gan, east of Tel Aviv, and served in Israeli intelligence for 6 years. She has a BA in communications and sociology from Hebrew University at Jerusalem. And so a big warm welcome to Linor for coming out to speak today. So, okay. So we have a set of structured questions that the Holy Land Committee has developed to ask both of our speakers, Linor and next week Ala Hamouda. So what we're going to do is walk through those questions for about the next 25 or so minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from everyone here to ask any questions. And Sarah, just wanted to ask if there was anything you wanted to say before we...
Are we going to do questions after these?
So we'll start with these kind of design questions and then open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I'll say something right before we open.
Okay, all right. So without further ado, welcome again, Linor. And the first question we wanted to ask you is just to tell us a little bit about yourself, what it was like growing up, and what motivates you in your field of work.
Great. So the question we almost always have to answer as Israel Fellows is, what is our story? To kind of tell our personal story. So I will start and say that my story is one of 1,000 different Israeli stories. So I can only represent myself and my experience. And to kind of give you the sense of what an Israeli story is that when you meet someone new in Israel, the first question they ask you is, what are you? Which sounds silly, but in essence it means, where are you from? Because it's an immigrant country, everyone came from all over the world, and in a sense that kind of tells them your story. So what I am is, I'm first of all the granddaughter of 4 grandparents who all grew up in Poland. On my mom's side, my grandfather made Aliyah, which means to immigrate to Israel. For Jews, it's kind of to going up. That's what it means literally, going up, making Aliyah, going up to Israel or to Jerusalem. He came to Israel in 1936, right before the Holocaust started, with two of his siblings. The rest of his family didn't believe something bad was going to happen and wanted to stick around, which did not end very well. And so that's my grandfather. My grandmother on my mom's side actually came to Israel in 1924. So they came to Tel Aviv, bought a little shack. The place was 5 years old at the time, Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city. And on my dad's side, both of my grandparents also came with the help of youth movements right before the war started in 1936, 1937. So that's kind of the background. And I think that says a lot about my Israel story, is because history is a part of my story too. It's not something that I look back on and say, oh, 200, 300 years ago, my ancestors came to that country. It's something very fresh in my mind. And I think it's something that leads me in life in a lot of ways in choosing what I want to do. So I grew up in Ramat Gan, around Tel Aviv, a very liberal, secular city. I come from a very secular Jewish family. Grew up there, went to high school, and then when I was 18, it's time to go into the army. There's mandatory service in Israel. I went into the intelligence forces. I ended up staying for 6 years. I had an amazing experience, learned a lot. It was eye-opening. I felt like I was doing something for the greater good, something that's bigger than myself, and I think that's a common feeling for a lot of Jewish Israelis who join the army, and not just Jewish Israelis, but in that line of looking at Israel as a miracle, which started with my grandparents and kept on, and I kept on with me. I think that definitely goes in line with that. When I finished my army service, I went into school. Normally, Israelis start school when they're 24, 25. After they're done with the army, they did a big trip, they worked a little, they spent all their money, and then they go into school. So I went to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It was important for me to move to Jerusalem and see a different part of what Israel is. It's a very different lifestyle. It's a holy city with everything around it being so much more important and meaningful. And it's a complicated city, and it's kind of all of Israel's conflicts into one place. So that was a very interesting experience. And at the time, I was working at the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. I was a tour guide, so I was exposed to democracy and different people and different opinions and different tourists coming in. So that kind of sparked the interest of telling Israel's story around the world. And then in the most spontaneous decision I've ever made, I signed up for the Jewish Agency Israel Fellow Program. I didn't really know what it was. I knew it meant to go abroad and work with Jewish communities in the US and elsewhere in the world, but I was like, let's give it a chance, let's see what happens. So I went through the application process, and I found myself within 2 months on a plane going to Boston. I spent 2 years there doing Israel education at Hillel, which is the Center for Jewish Life on campuses. And last year I moved to DC. I now work at Georgetown University and a little bit at Hillel International, which is the main organization here headquartered in DC. And that's in a very long nutshell.
That's a good nutshell. Thank you. We also wanted to ask you, just as a woman, what's your perspective toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and whether you feel society has certain expectations of you as a woman and what those might be?
So my first instinct when I saw that question is to say, there's no difference. And I think the Army, in a sense, does that because it's mandatory service and everyone goes. There's a sense of we all have the same type of responsibility and we all have the same share in what happens. So in that case, I would say there's no difference. But when I was working at the Parliament, we had this tour called Women in Politics. And when I learned it and I kind of looked more into it, I found how much power women have had in Israel since the day it was established. There are 2 women signed on the Declaration of Independence. There's a very prominent woman in Israeli politics, Tzipi Livni, who ran the negotiations for 2 years between the Israelis and Palestinians. And there's another thing that I found out is that there's a UN resolution, 1325, that calls for women to be involved in conflict resolution around the world, recognizing, A, that women are oftentimes victims of conflict, but also have the power to make a difference in what negotiations look like. So that's definitely something I've been inspired by, and I think also for us Israel Fellows, there's a majority of women doing this job, of talking to students in campuses and trying to find common ground. So I definitely see that as a common thread in what women are able to do.
Okay, thank you. Now getting towards kind of the heart of the issue, just what do you view as the primary reasons for the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So I'm sure you've heard and read a lot about more of the facts on the ground, however you see facts. There are different ways to see them, but I don't think that's my added value to talk about land and religious issues. I think something that I've learned, especially being here, is the power of narratives. And I think that's something that on both ends we've got a long way to work on. Growing up as an Israeli, there was a very strong narrative of what the story is. We had 5 wars, and it's a constant struggle for our living, and everyone around us wants us gone, and that type of narrative helps you or prevents you from seeing that there's another side to the story. And something that through first living in Jerusalem and then moving here and kind of being exposed to different voices is something that I realized that that's the first thing we have to tackle if we want to get anywhere, is to educate ourselves about the other side. And I think that's true for both sides, to learn the other side of the story. And those narratives oftentimes are very conflicted. And I can't tell you that I have the answers on how to bring them together and create one story. But I think listening to each other, and that goes through education first and foremost, is the best that we can do right now to move it forward. Because the solution, everyone knows what that looks like at the end of the day. It could be a little different, a couple inches here, a couple inches there on the map, but we all know what it looks like. I think there's a mental way to go for both people to be ready to talk to each other and to be ready to trust each other.
Thank you. Have you been personally affected by the conflict, and in what ways?
I think everyone living in that region has been, in ways that we don't always know about even. First of all, I think Israelis are a people with PTSD constantly. That has to do with our military experience, with life in Israel. It's very normal to tell a story of how a siren went off and I had to get out of my car and lie down on the side of the road because there were rockets, and then going back into my car and continuing my day. So those things, we normalize them in the way we tell our story, but they're not normal at all, having to live that way. Or I remember myself when I was younger, in the early 2000s, there was what was called the Intifada. It was a violent outbreak, and there were buses and cafes blowing up every day, and watching that on the news and not being able to call your family because all the phone lines are down. And that's, again, something we kind of normalize, and we say, oh, that's another thing. I think a lot of Israeli mentality, we have this saying, Ze ma yesh. It is what it is. It's a complicated situation. We don't see it being resolved any day now. So we kind of have to live with it. And what's interesting is coming here and seeing a different perspective of life that isn't constantly worried about safety and security allows you to think of bigger things and bigger ideas and be more creative and be able to let go of anger and let go of difficult emotions that you have when you're right inside of that really heated area of the world, and to look at it from the outside and see that maybe there's a different way, and maybe I don't want my kids to grow up that way. So everyone's definitely been affected of that, yeah.
What do you consider to be the main obstacles to peace, and what do you think could be done to resolve those issues?
So I think that on the national level, definitely leadership on both sides. There needs to be a strong and brave leader. There's a lot of contradicting voices, and I see that at least for the Israeli society. We're 1 month out of elections, and the biggest conversation is obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and where the next prime minister or the next leading party, how they see it being resolved. The conversation is very toxic. It's not healthy. It's not going in positive directions. Again, because people are very angry and people are very frustrated, and it's been years on both sides. So I think it takes a really brave leader to make a difference. I don't know if you guys know of Yitzhak Rabin. He was assassinated in 1995. He was the prime minister of Israel, and he was the last to really take a strong move towards peace. And as you can see, it wasn't welcomed all wonderfully by everyone, but it really takes a lot of leadership, which I'm hopeful for. I think the next election might be able to bring some new spirits into the game. And on the personal level, it's just being exposed to the other side, which we don't get to do ever, not even within Israel. The first time I met a narrative that was different than mine, someone who was Arab Israeli was in college. It was the first time I had a friend who kind of told me the story from their angle. And I think that really opened up my mind and really showed me that there's another story to consider. There's another way to look at things. And as long as we don't get exposed to other people, we can't let go of fear and trauma, and we can't trust. And that's, I think, on the interpersonal level, a very important step.
Okay. So you may have alluded to this a little bit just now in answering the question, but in what ways do you think your own people, Israelis and leaders, have contributed to some of the problems?
So kind of to what I was saying, I think in a way it's convenient to what we call handle the conflict instead of resolve it. It's the status quo nowadays, unfortunately. There isn't enough push to see things in a different way, to try and resolve things. There are always excuses, like the leadership on the other side, or this is a problem, or this recognition is needed for us to move along. So there's definitely, that's something that needs to change. Extremism too, religious extremism, a lot of the times is something that we see as an obstacle. It causes a lot of internal issues also, so it's not the only place where it's an issue, but extremism in general, I think, is something that's pulling us in opposite directions than where we want to go. And I think, again, Israelis not doing enough to get to know the other side. There's a lot of fear. Something I always think about is, I'm thinking of myself growing up when I was 12. Again, that was the time, early 2000s. It was a very intense time in Israel. So if I hadn't personally gotten to know Arab Israelis, I would always have that idea of like that equivalence in my head of like, this is what happened and this is what I associate with this group of people. And the same way the other way around. Like when people my age were 12, the only association of Israelis that they have are soldiers coming into their villages. So there's a lot of misinformation about the other side and a lot of categorizing of the other side in one box. And I think that's definitely something we're not doing enough to work through.
Okay. So if you put on your Shlichut hat, I guess, what would you like the world to know about the situation? What things does the world community misunderstand about the issue?
I think first of all is that at the end of the day, we're all people who just want to live. And I think that's true for both sides. You know, when you wake up in the morning, you don't always think about the big things, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You think about your rent and your taxes and where you're going to have for breakfast. And it's hard to think about it from the outside, but in a way it's normalized. It's the only life we know. We know life in a conflict, and it's how we operate. So first of all that. The second thing is, I think about intent. I think with Israel, a lot of the times there's this portrayal of like an attempt of genocide or ethnic cleansing or all these big words that are being said. And as someone who served in the army, I can say that that's exactly the opposite of what I see. I mean, there's so much care around, especially from like the army and the people executing orders in that sense. There's so much care and carefulness about everything that's being done. And from the outside, it may be categorized as like Israel killed this, or Israel did that, or Israel shot down people at the fence. But I feel like the whole story isn't always told about the circumstances. And of course, I never support the death of innocent civilians. But growing up in a state of war in a way, I understand that sometimes reality is a lot more complicated than what it's like when it's portrayed in the news. That's one thing. And yeah, I think that there really is a will, at least from the Israeli side, that's the only side I can talk about, to move forward and to to work towards peace. And for us, it's really frustrating knowing that it can't happen tomorrow, and it's not something that's going to easily be resolved. And I think also differences in mentality. A lot of the times here when I speak to Americans, sometimes American Jews who are very, very liberal, and I kind of get the sense that they look at the conflict and they're like, I don't get why can't you all just get along, just figure it out, what's the problem? But it's very hard to kind of take those liberal values that are easier to obtain here in America and throw them on a situation and a mentality that's very different. You know, we're people who, each of these groups come with a very rich history and a very strong story of who they are, and it's something that's very hard to let go of. And even I sometimes say, okay, let's move on. Like, we had the Holocaust, yes, that was a huge issue, and it's where we are now. To the Palestinians, it's the idea of the Nakba of 1948. Yes, that is a huge part of the story. And we both want to get over it, and we both want to move forward, but it's not something that's so easy to let go, and I think that's a big part of where the conflict is at.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So kind of a more hopeful outlook then. What things give you hope about a resolution of the conflict on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side? Are there things that you find as hopeful signs?
So actually being here, I got more exposed to, with the work I do on campus, sometimes we go on trips that are more focused on the conflict with students who aren't Jewish. We take them to Israel to tour both the Israeli side and the West Bank, the Palestinian side, and we meet a lot of organizations that do work on the ground. And the first time I met one of these organizations that focus on dialogue, I was blown away. It was amazing to me. Basically what they're saying is, we live here together now, and we got to learn to live together. Until our governments figure out the logistics of how to make this work permanently, we have to live with each other and we have to build trust. And they do youth activities together and women's groups together and really builds a joint community made out of people who, if you'd asked them a year before, they'd tell you, I would never talk to this person. I'd never come to their village or come to their house for dinner, and now they're partners and friends in the same community. So to me, that's and I'm seeing more and more of these grassroots organizations popping up. So it's kind of making the best out of a pretty difficult situation. And it's something that makes me very hopeful, and it's something that I hope to work with when I go back home.
Okay. Well, the last question that we want to ask here is, what can we as a community of faith do to help?
So I can say that a story around that would be that a couple months ago there was the event at Pittsburgh at Tree of Life Synagogue, and it's the first time I was here. It's the first time I was exposed to a really anti-Semitic incident in that size, and to see how communities gathered around there was an amazing thing for me to see. I went to a service at Addis Israel in DC, and there were Christian communities and Muslim communities, and everyone around the city was there to support. And I saw videos of a Muslim community collecting money and donations for the Pittsburgh, for the families of those who died. And it was so powerful. And truthfully, I was jealous. I saw this happening here, and coming from a region where religion is oftentimes this extreme thing that's causing a lot of the problems, and to see religion being such a beautiful thing, helping solve problems and helping people come together, really I was jealous. I looked at it and I said, I wish I could have the same type of support back home, and I could feel the same type of support from members of other religions. And I think that's exactly the power. The power is in coming together and in supporting one another, and out of the place of religion, kind of overcoming differences.
Okay, thank you. We do want to open it up for questions from the audience. Siri?
I just want to do a quick preface to our questions. So when I speak to groups, I often say, because I'm a Palestinian, this is not an intellectual exercise for me. So when I walk out of here, I take this story with me. So I always invite people to be extremely respectful in the way that they ask me those questions. And I just want to say what a treasure it is for us to have Linor with us today, and next week we'll have Alat speaking, and really just a gift to learn something that we might not know. And so today in our questions, I just invite you to be radically curious If Linor shares something that you might disagree with, that's okay. I don't think we're looking for a complete agreement around the subject. I think that's a hard thing to ask for with this particular subject especially. And so thank you for your generous spirits, and let's learn more from Linor during this question and answer time.
Hi, my name's Earl Foote. I'm a visitor here. And I wanted to ask Linor, why, as an Israeli, why do you think that Israel is singled out for condemnation? The UN condemns Israel more times than all other nations combined, and Israel is condemned by such paragons of democracy as China and Iran. So why does Israel get such a bad press, and why, I mean, I'm not saying Israel's perfect, but why does the world seem to focus on Israel and condemning Israel?
Mm-hmm. So I used to think this was a silly answer to bring anti-Semitism onto the table here, but I heard Yossi Klein Halevi, who's an American-Israeli author, and the way he explained it, I thought it was beautiful. You have the book, wonderful. You're totally in the loop of that. So he gave a talk around his book, and he said something very interesting. He said that throughout the years, the way anti-Semitism looked like all over the world is whatever society perceived to be the worst attributes at the time, they stuck it onto the Jews. And now in 2019, what are really bad things that we talk about? We talk about colonialism, we talk about apartheid, racism, all those words that Israel is described in all over the news. And he says Israel, in a way, is not only the state of the Jews, but it is the Jew of the states. So all of these, it's very easy to kind of put all this weight onto Israel. I don't think it's the only thing. I think there's a huge attraction to that region of the world to begin with. There's always things going on, and Israel, to be honest, is a bit foreign in that region, right? There are a lot of dynamics happening around that have nothing to do with it, and it's being influenced by. The allyship with the US, I think, is a very strong bond that isn't always perceived as a positive one around the world. And so I hate that it's a simplified answer, but after 3 years of being here and kind of looking at it from the outside, it's pretty much the way I see it now.
How do you ensure conflict resolution of the fights?
How do I share? Ensure conflict resolution. I can only answer on my level and what I do here in the world of campuses, which is to bring people with different opinions to start talking to each other. I think, again, the same way that I kind of described the way we categorize the other and what we think of the other, the biggest challenge is to bring people and to find common ground and to talk to each other. On the campus level, I can say that we work with different student leaders from different groups that don't always historically have a great relationship with the Jewish community or with pro-Israel groups on campus. And we just want them to get to know each other first as friends and as people, and then start talking about the bigger issues. We do this oftentimes with Muslim communities where Israel is a bit of an obstacle. We're not ready to get to talking about Israel, but we're ready to start talking interfaith, for example. So that's a good place to start, finding something that you have in common and you can start the conversation from, and then growing from there into a bigger conversation about conflicts.
Hi. My name is Pam. I'm a member at St. John's, and I have extended family living in Israel. I wanted to return to the religious extremism issue and the fact that I believe that by the Constitution, the Orthodox have religious authority over a lot of things. We came up against this when a member of our family was being buried there. We had to have an Orthodox rabbi, and it was just a really tense thing that we couldn't make our own choices about this. Is there any movement that's making progress towards not having an established kind of Judaism in charge of all that they like marriage and burials and that sort of thing in Israel?
So I'll just give a little background on that. So Israel has the complicated title of being a Jewish democratic state. And then the questions are, what is Jewish? And how is Jewish? How does religion go with democracy? And there are all these questions. The answer is very complicated. The Judaism that's officially recognized by the government is Orthodox Judaism, meaning there's a ruling religious institution in Israel called the Rabbanut. It's an Orthodox institution, and that kind of sets the status quo of what it means to be a Jewish state. In what ways is it Jewish? So for example, stores need to be closed on Shabbat, which is the holy day. So that's something that the Rabbanut stands. What does marriage look like? There's Orthodox marriage. So naturally, not everyone in Israel agrees on that. There's a big portion of the population that's secular. I come from a secular family, and I don't enjoy having stores closed on Saturday, and it's always a conflict and a question of, do we want to have a Jewish character to the country, or do I care more about me wanting to go shopping on Saturday or me wanting to take the bus on Saturday? So obviously it's a very complicated question, and it goes into civil marriage. We don't have civil marriage in Israel. If you want to get married, it's only through a religious avenue, whether that be Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. But there are definitely efforts being done. On one hand, the extreme voices are getting more extreme, because the more they feel like it's being taken away from them, the more they want to hold on. But there are definitely, first of all, the reform and conservative movements are becoming stronger in Israel. And part of what we do is connecting those communities here to what's happening in Israel, so both sides can learn about each other's struggles. And if the reform and conservative movements here see it as something important to bring those values to Israel, then when I go back in a couple months to Israel, that's an agenda that I want to push for in the Israeli society. So the more people like me, like my friend Shira, who are exposed to what's happening here, is definitely helpful to bringing those values back home. And I think through a lot of other movements, the LGBT movement, for example, is a movement that's really helping us push for pluralism in religion. The problem is our political system. Our political system is based on coalitions, and from the establishment of the state, there's always been a need to incorporate the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition. It's a numbers game. They needed a majority, and when they're in the coalition, they have a voice. So for the first time 2 years ago, they were able to form a government without the ultra-Orthodox. They were able to push a lot of more liberal bills through. For example, ultra-Orthodox people don't join the military. They refuse to join the military a lot of the times. So they passed a bill forcing a certain amount of them, a certain percentage of them, even as a representation, to join the military, but then the next government overturned it. So it's at the end of the day, it's both a political game and a civil game of pushing for pluralism.
I'm interested in your experience in the culture of the military as part of mandatory service. So everybody starts their adult conversation in that context, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, would that be a place where we could change the dialogue? Mm-hmm. Is it consistent kind of across all of the parts of the services, and kind of how does it work? What's the tone like? Mm-hmm.
So I think it's definitely, your experience definitely changes you. Obviously, I wasn't a combat soldier. I wasn't in areas where I had to see very complicated situations in front of my eyes. I don't know what that does to people. I mean, I've heard stories from friends, but I think the conversation in the Israeli society is moving also in a positive direction there, of allowing soldiers to kind of open up those stories and talk about those things and talk about PTSD and the kind of things you're exposed to and how to process them, because we weren't always that great at processing everything that at the end of the day, you're 18 and you're being thrown into a situation that's very difficult. I can give you an example of a story. When I went with my trip of non-Jewish students to Israel, we were with our bus in an area that it's in the West Bank, and we passed by this incident that we saw a soldier aiming a weapon at a Palestinian. And the students saw that and they were terrified. They were like, what's happening? Like, why is this happening? And we obviously didn't have the answers. We were just driving by. And luckily we had a very brave tour guide who said, let's turn the bus around. Let's see what happened. Let's go ask. So we turn around and we had the soldier come up on the bus, and the students see this 20-year-old kid who's their age, blushed cheeks and everything, and they asked him to tell them what happened. And he said, well, I was here and there was a block in the road and they didn't notice it, and they kept on walking and we had to stop them. And then we said, well, why aim a weapon? Why can't you talk? And he said, well, because sometimes we talk to someone for 5 minutes and then they pull a knife at us. And I asked, well, how often does that happen? And he's like, well, not a lot, once a month. And it makes the situation like you're seeing a 20-year-old kid in front of you and you realize neither him nor this Palestinian guy he just arrested want to be in this situation, but it's a very complicated situation and definitely does something to you. On the other hand, I can say that my area, which is intelligence, we would always have this joke of like, the people who work around the Palestinian arena are always the most lefty, always the most liberal, because you see the human side of things, and it kind of shows you the full picture, and you say, I understand my role in this story. I understand that right now I'm in the army and I do what I need to do, but it also makes me a more aware and thoughtful citizen once I'm done. And I think we can also see this in politics now. A lot of the former generals going into politics tend to take a more center-left political stand, because I think when you're in the army, you see the entire reality, and you see how unfortunate it is on both sides, and you just want a different reality for your kids.
Thanks for being here. The message that you bring, full of hope and positive energy. Thank you for that. Could you, so we can understand, you share with us the organization that you're a fellow of, ultimately how representative it is? It's funding, is it government sponsored? Where does this funding come from? And echoing back some of your comments just now, like, center left, right, so we can understand that. Thank you.
So I'll start, we're kind of, in our role, we're a part of two different organizations, the Jewish Agency and Hillel International. So the Jewish Agency was an organization that started in the early 1900s as kind of a uniting force for Jews all over the world before the State of Israel was even a thought. And it worked to connect Jewish communities to one another, mainly. And then as the idea of Zionism was starting to form, and as the idea of a Jewish state was starting to form, the Jewish Agency had a big role in bringing the people, right? We want the Jews from all over the world to be in our Jewish state, so that was something that they did. And when the state was just established, before they were able to form a government, the Jewish Agency kind of took on that role as a temporary government. So it's today it's partially funded by the government, partially funded by Jewish donors all over the world. And today its main objective is to connect Jewish communities around the world to Israel and vice versa. To be that, at the end of the day, 50% of the Jewish population doesn't live in Israel. It lives all over the world, and mainly in the US. So doing that work to connect communities together. And I think the way we see our role is not to be political advocates of the government. I think also from what I said, it's pretty clear that I don't always support what's happening in the government, but to just give a personal perspective of what life in Israel is. For a lot of Jews who live abroad, they've never met an Israeli until they've met their shaliach, the person who does my job. So for them to make it a little more human, and I think especially in the campus sphere, so that's where the other organization comes in, it's Hillel International, that is a Jewish center for Jewish life on college campuses. It doesn't take a political stance. It's like I support this policy or that policy. It takes a stance of we support the state of Israel, and we see Israel as a core part of Jewish education and how we get students involved with their Jewish identity. Israel is a part of the story whether they like it or not. Not only the modern state of Israel, but where Israel fits into their religious story. So for us to be able to help them through that relationship, to guide them through it, to help them see both the human perspective and allow them experiences, whether it's going to Israel or meeting with speakers who come here and kind of give them that perspective. So the goal is really to start a conversation. There's no political agenda that we're trying to push for. But obviously, I think the populations we work with who are 18 to 22-year-old American Jews, I would say that the majority of the students that I've worked with are more liberal leaning. And that's something that you have to, for me, it was relatively easy to have those conversations, but not to all Israel fellows who come in. Some have more conservative ideas, and to kind of learn to have a conversation about Israel in terms that relate to that age group.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I think we'd all like to see a two-state solution come about. But there's one thing I've been reading about, which I find quite disturbing, which is that in Area C, which is something like 60% of the West Bank, the government encourages Israelis, a Jewish settlement, but will not give building permits to Arabs. Is that correct? And how does that consort with the idea of a solution?
So I just want to make sure that I heard what you said. You said they give what to a Jewish?
They give building permits for Jewish settlements, but it's almost impossible for an Arab to get a building permit. And if they build a house without a permit, the government tears it down. So I don't see how that in any way can be reconciled with the settlement of the overall problem.
Mm-hmm. So again, I'm not a part of politics, so I can't give you the official answer of the Israeli government. I can only tell you how I read the situation. It's definitely far from being ideal, and it definitely pains me too that life doesn't always look the same for Jews and Palestinians in those areas. I think through the Oslo Accords, or what you're referring to as Area C, Area B, Area A, that's kind of with the first step that I mentioned, Yitzhak Rabin, that was his project of taking the first step to establishing a two-state solution. It was the beginning of the process. It definitely wasn't a perfect process, and it didn't solve all problems. It was able to give Palestinians sovereignty in Area A, partially in Area B. Area C is the most complicated of those, and that would be the first one that would have to be dealt with when it comes to a two-state solution. And that in terms of territory too, that's where the biggest conversation of territory is, because Area A and B are pretty obvious. Those are majority Palestinian areas, but Area C is where most of the conflict is. And you're right, you're hitting the nail on the head. That is the most problematic area. I don't have an answer. I can agree with you that it's not a great situation, and I hope that the resolution of it would come sooner rather than later.
I'm guessing that you're a little unusual in your generation in the sense that you know a little bit more about the Palestinians than most of your cohorts do. And I'm guessing if that's right, and that's the same thing 50 years from now, we'll be in the same place 50 years from now. So there probably are no incentives for an Israeli or a Palestinian to get to know the other side. How can you build some incentives to change that?
My answer would always be education. I think education is the main tool we have to bring people together and get to know each other. I think programs have developed since I grew up. For example, taking Arabic as a mandatory language today in Israeli Jewish schools is something that's starting in the 2nd grade. When I started, it was 7th grade. So that's one step. Let's learn the language so we can talk to other people. The other thing is programs. There are a lot of programs that are building dialogue around the country on both sides that are pushing people into leadership too. That's kind of associating, let's get to know each other, but also let's be leaders in the solution of this conflict. So that's something I'm definitely hopeful about. And as you grow up, you get into more and more, like when I said I went to Hebrew University, I decided to move to Jerusalem, which is a mixed city. It has both Arabs and Jews living there. So for me, that was the first step in getting to know each other. I didn't really need an incentive, but to go into the university I wanted to go in. So I think more and more we definitely can see. And I think for specifically the only people that we can really access is Arabs living in Israel, Arab Israelis. Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, that's a little harder because of border issues. We don't get to see them as much, but at least start somewhere and start with what we can have and the stories that we can hear. I think that's more accessible than most people think, and I think through education we can push for that a little more.
So I'm going to ask a quick question. It's not a quick question, actually. But Linor, I recognize you're not a spokesperson for the state of Israel, but one thing that in the Arab circles, and also Greg and I have talked about this, there's a perception, a really strong perception, that that while the people in Israel, like Israelis, want to find ways to have a solution and to kind of live at peace with Palestinians, like you said, just to live. Like when people want to wake up, they want to think about their laundry. They don't want to think about, whatever. But there's this perception that on the higher level that there is still an agenda, like a nationalistic Zionist agenda that wants to take the entire land and that's one of the big reasons why settlements are encouraged, so that it becomes harder for Palestinians to have a viable state in the end. So my question to you is is that idea of a Zionist kind of agenda on the top level of government, is that true from your perspective? And how is that passed along when the average person on the streets might not really know that or think about it? I don't even know what you're hearing in this question.
Well, I would just tweak that in our conversations, we both believe that the other side has that same maximalist, nationalist feeling. So that you're describing that the Jews want to take everything, and that we've talked about how there's a perception that the Palestinians also want to reclaim or take, whatever the right word is, with the demise of Israel.
That's a sneak preview into 2 weeks from now, my friends. Good. Thank you.
But definitely, you were two things on that. First is, I totally agree with Greg. I think there's that perception on both sides. I think if you ask the, let's say, 70-year-old cynical Israeli that hasn't really met anyone different than him his whole life, you'd say, oh, of course, they want the whole land. They won't rest until they have the whole land. Which I'm sure if you ask a Palestinian that same age who's been through what he's been through, he would probably say the same thing. So A, it's a lot of misperceptions, and that's coming from not really knowing each other. B, I would say that there's a confusion of Zionism, the word Zionism, with this approach of yes, we think the entirety of what we perceived the land of Israel should be ours. But I think the biggest voices today in politics are saying the only way we can remain a Jewish democratic state is if we have a two-state solution, because of the demographics of it, right? If we go with the extreme religious belief of the whole land belongs to us, then we like it or not, there are I don't know how many million Palestinians living on that land. So it's not going to be a Jewish democratic state anymore. It's either not going to be democratic or it's not going to be Jewish. So the biggest supporters of Zionism today in Israeli politics are calling out for a two-state solution exactly for that reason. But I think the misconception definitely exists within the people, of people thinking the other, and we each have our own stories and why we tell them of on the Israeli side, I can say is we've offered them so many times, 90-something% of the land that they wanted, but that was never enough because they don't want to recognize Israel being a Jewish state. That's also something people say a lot on both ends. Palestinians don't want to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, and Israelis won't recognize the Palestinian claim to the land, and that's the problem with the narratives. It always goes back to the narratives. Those narratives are clashing, they're contradicting, and until we sit down and talk and realize what we do have in common, what kind of story we want to tell moving on forward, then we're always going to stick to those big ideas of how we perceive Zionism or how we perceive the Palestinian nationality. So it's definitely about. I think politics is one thing, but talking to each other is definitely the way to move forward.
I have another question that sort of is consistent with that, and that really goes to the fact that many people talk about how the leadership on both sides are very old, very set, very stuck in their own stories. I'd like you to talk a little bit about where you see youth and youth leadership being a part of the future.
So there are a lot of youth organizations working especially in the sphere of getting to know each other, organizations like Seeds of Peace, who take kids from conflict areas and have them meet each other and talk about conflicts and how to resolve them. In general, Israel is I can say on the side of Israel, it's a country of activists and a country of entrepreneurs. And you can see that in tech, and you can see that in civil discourse, and you can see that in politics. I think the younger generation is definitely approaching. I was just talking to a friend the other week, and he was saying, it's our time. It's our time. There's no way to look at the story differently. It's our time to take the lead. These people have seen too much. They're too traumatized from the situation. They can't be creative anymore. And I think we can see that. There's new blood in politics now in Israel, and hopefully that would bring about a change. And it's definitely coming from the youth movements. That's also a big part of Israeli culture is youth movements. The scouts and working and learning youth and people pushing for a healthier discourse in society, toning down feelings of racism and not knowing the other and learning how to work around conflicts. And I think that's definitely the new blood and spirit we're going to see.
Can I ask, do you see any of those voices running for office and sort of changing the fundamental makeup of the legislature in like the next couple of decades?
So more so in the list, not yet in leadership. There's a problem in the way, and this is again part of the narrative, in the way Israelis look at their politicians. And no matter how bad the economy is, or health issues, or whatever it is that the Israeli voter cares about, at the end of the day, they need to see a leader that they feel could win a war. Because that's still a part of our mentality, unfortunately. And we're not just talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of the conflicts that we're surrounded by, and there are many of those. And so still the image of the general is something that's very important to the Israeli voter. So even if we see a different political stance, it oftentimes comes in the same suit. So now we have a new party running. It has 3 former chiefs of staff of the military. So if you look at it from outside, you would say it's the same thing. It's exactly the same approach. It's a military guy. But on the other hand, I can say that I've seen today's politicians and leaders talk about when all those politicians just started running for office, they said something like, what are they putting in their water? Like, why are they all so liberal? They come out of the army, they're so liberal. So it is something that's changing, but it's hard because you have to kind of mask it to the Israeli voters. Like, we are still security first. That is still our first thing on the agenda. But I truly believe that behind the scenes, there's definitely a new way of thinking of things.
Hello, Peter, and I was just going to ask, how can Israelis and people in Israel and Palestine change laws which are different for Jews than Arabs, like laws where if someone leaves Israel, Palestine, and they're not Jewish, they can't return to Israel, Palestine, and get like justice and the ability to go home to those people who, if they were Israeli, they could just leave and come back. But if they're Palestinian, they leave, they can't return to their home, and they can't come back, and they lose their ability to go probably where they grew up. Thanks.
So I'm not sure I'm familiar with exactly. Did you? Mm-hmm. Right. So I think there's definitely the situation, because the situation, it kind of relates to the former question that was asked, the situation in the West Bank. I think every Palestinian that has a right to vote in Israel, which is Arab Israelis and some of the Palestinians living around Jerusalem, I think that's, first of all, the first way to go, is be a part of politics, participate in the political system. There are Arab Israeli parties in the Knesset. They are oftentimes in the opposition, which makes it harder to actually change things. But even to represent the other voice, that is definitely their role in the political level. On the ground, it's going to be a part of a solution, of a greater solution. I mean, I think dealing with one law at a time is definitely progress, but if I'm being 100% honest, I don't see that being a priority until it's a part of a full package of how do we resolve this thing.
It's 11 o'clock. Should we, do you think?
Do you have a last question?
I'm happy to ask a last question. So I have this is probably not going to be an easy question, but just thinking about the issue of whether criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, or, I guess what I want to get at is we've had this issue has been here publicly in our Congress recently as well, and I guess the way I am coming at it is that I see the fundamental problem in the conflict, if I can simplify it at the risk of simplifying it, as being the occupation, and how do you resolve the occupation, the facts on the ground that you mentioned earlier, and if you can't do that by criticizing Israeli policy to bring about some kind of change, if criticism of Israeli policy is anti-Semitic, then all who want to change that policy are kind of in a bind, like how do we express our views? And so, I don't know, I realize this is coming across more as a comment than a question, but I welcome you to comment also.
So first of all, I definitely don't think that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. 100%
Okay.
not the case. I myself have a lot of criticism for the Israeli government, and I think something that when I started Shlichut, when I was just about to go, I was applying and I was talking to a friend who had already done it, and I was saying, but there are so many things I complain about on the daily basis, and it's sometimes internal issues completely, sometimes it's regarding the conflict, and how am I supposed to go and speak to people and represent Israel? How do I do that? And they said, the kind of criticism that you will encounter isn't really dealing with the details a lot of the times. It is dealing with the bigger picture. And this question of should Israel exist? It's a question we ask ourselves a lot, and it's like, well, there are like 8 million people who live there. I don't know that it's a question we can like easily just joke around about. So I definitely think there's room for criticism, and we need those voices in order to move forward. But I think it depends on what the tactic we choose after. So a lot of the times organizations here go for the tactic of boycott, which I don't think is really helping anyone come together. Something that I think I said a lot and I really see as the way to solution is education and dialogue. And I think there's a power in someone coming from the outside and sitting both parties at a table, whether those be politicians or just people, and getting them to talk to each other and using that outsider perspective instead of like boycotting the situation or not having not wanting anything to do with it. A lot of times that happens too. I think with Jews here as well, they're like, "Ooh, I don't get it, it's too complicated, I just don't want to be a part of it," and kind of pushing that aside. I think participating, asking questions, challenging both parties involved, bringing them together to a table to talk, and in that case, every criticism is totally legitimate and welcome, I think, because that's what creates a dialogue. That's what helped me see things differently. Being here, hearing other people's perspective on it, seeing how from the outside things might look a little more complicated or a little different than they do on the inside, and it made me think, okay, maybe I was looking at it wrong. Maybe there's something else we can do. So criticism is a healthy thing, and I appreciate and welcome it.
Good, thank you. Linor, we just want to thank you so much for coming here and sharing your views.
Thank you for having me.